So, critiquing. Before we get into each individual critique, I want to make a note that this is just my opinion. This is just my relative stance on things. If you don't agree with it, just take it with a grain of salt and move on. I don't think there's any need to get defensive, and I'm not trying to say that my opinion is right or better. I just want to say that this is my opinion from the experience that I've had as a teacher and then going around seeing other artists and even artists as my friends and being able to help one another. And I feel like I'm going to give the most unbiased opinion as I can and try to help you in the best direction and style that it seems you're already intent on going. So if you like to draw anime and stylization, I'm not going to push you toward realism just because I'm more familiar with that. I want to push you more down that realm, but then critique it in a way that is helpful for you. And the second thing is, I don't want anyone feeling that I am attacking them or that this is something you need to get defensive over. I learned very early in my high school years because I had a very aggressive teacher and she rarely complimented me. It actually turned out to help me in the long run because it turns out I needed someone that was a bit more direct and blunt, and it really worked with my learning curve. Well, I think whoever just followed. Actually, let me pull up my OBS so I can always see who did that. Oxy, Owzy, I think it's pronounced. Thank you for following. And what was I just talking about? Oh, yeah, my teacher did such a great job at knowing how to really hone in my skills and bring them out, even though it was a lot of frustration and anger on my part. But I think I needed that. I needed a good kick in the butt. But I've learned that that doesn't work for everyone. And I even talked to Sean even before the stream started on how for him, that's the only thing he knew, and that's how he learned and grew. And who would have known if I would have been in high school and I had more of an overly complimentary teacher, what would have happened to me in the direction I went in. But I'm really glad that the teacher pushed me in this direction, and I'm hoping to do the same, but not as cruel. I definitely had some days where I was very, very angry. But I learned that it's better to be truthful, but firm. I don't think there's any room for maliciousness or belittling. I think being firm with someone can get the point across without it being belittling. So that's my goal today, and if it ever comes across like that, I do apologize. That is not my intent. I want to help this artist community grow and become stronger, and that is truly why I do these community critique streams. And because I think a lot of you learn from them, and I just find them very helpful. So if you miss it, or if you want to rewatch something, I will post this on YouTube, and maybe you're watching on YouTube right now. Who knows? This is the future. Okay. And I'm going to wait for comments and questions for like every 2 critiques, I want to say. And that way we can get through them faster and have more of a Q&A at the end. But if you have any concerning comments, please put @vonnart before it, and I will periodically look over. Okay. So we're going to go ahead and start the stream here. And let me know if the furnace is too loud. I'm in the basement and I'm right next to the boiler room, and I can definitely turn that down. Okay. Just checked out your Instagram and holy poop, you're amazing. Well, thank you. So I picked 8. 3 of them, like I said, were my Patreon backers that submitted, and the other 5 I just chose at random, and the ones that I thought I could give the best helpful insight to. So the first one, I want to make sure that you guys can see this all right. I'll put it right there. Oops, do I still have my how to draw a head and profile thing up? 1 second. Let me change that really quick. And I think another good thing about community critiques is especially doing them live, is that even if you aren't, there we go. Even if you aren't the one being critiqued or have your image on the screen, I think you can learn a lot just from watching other people be critiqued and watching the tips and advice I'm giving, and hopefully that will be something that can relate to your own work, and then you can adjust even without it being your own illustration. Okay, so the first one was Sak 3 Rin, and this one was one that they said was one of their favorites, and they wanted any insight to see how to be improved upon. Now, like I said, a lot of this is going to be my own opinion and taste, so take it with a grain of salt. So when I first look at this, I actually do like the composition you have going on. Obviously, I'm a big center frame nerd, and I like the color here. My favorite color, besides like red and yellow, like obvious colors, I think my true favorite would be a gray. I think gray helps amplify other colors and really sets a more muted tone for the colors that are in the piece to really stand out and be flourished. So I like the color palette you have going on here. The one thing I noticed right away is the head and neck felt a little out of proportion, and her neck, because it's coming so close to the edge of the sweater, the turtleneck, it almost looks like her neck is super wide. So on a lot of these, I did a really quick paint over first, and then I'm going to do some live painting here as well. So the first thing that I wanted to do was the neck for sure. And then the second thing were where the hands felt so timid, so scared. It was like you were trying to hide them. And this is a good example of like, let them be prominent, let them be shown. And I think it could really add to the emotion of the feeling that she's going here with her looking up. And instead of these very hidden hands that can barely really tell a story, you can still have them hiding, but have them prominent enough where they're doing some kind of a pose that feels like it's adding to the piece, where I feel like the hands here were kind of tacked on. So the first thing I did was I'll show back and forth. Let me just make sure my OBS, I can see it. There we go. So you can see how when I turn this layer on and off, I basically pulled her jaw back a bit, and I made the neck a little smaller to fit with the proportion that I felt she was given. And you'll see in my second paint over how I extended the turtleneck forward. But when I turn it on and off, you can see how it really feels like her jaw was stretched on the bottom, and there's a lot of distance between her ear and her chin, which usually people have the other problem of their chin and their ear being too close together, but I feel like this image actually had the opposite, where they were too far apart. And then the second thing I noticed was if you have the image backlit, which I think is a really cool idea, if you're going to add realistic lighting, it needs to be consistent. And especially with characters, people feel the need to add depth shading on a face, even if it's completely in shadow. Now, there will be minor shading and shadows that will be, like occlusion shadows will definitely be there. But for the most part, I put a pretty matte shadow color on the back of her face, and now it really looks like there is a light source behind her, where before it almost looks like there's a giant light source behind her and like a softer one in front. But if you really want to push this composition of a backlight with the sun or whatever this light is in the background pouring on her on the side, I would push the skin tone to be more matte in the shadow. And this is something that I think a lot of artists do, where if you include lighting, keep it consistent and be confident with the placement. And with this being such a far away light and having just a very little bounce light, you probably won't get a lot of actual value on the face. So keeping it more matte will actually create a more believable scene. And let's see what I did with this other layer here. Oh yeah, the other layer was basically emphasizing to pull the hands just a little further out of the sweater and make them bigger. They felt very, very small compared to the proportion of her head and neck. And I think making the hands larger would help kind of full out her character a bit more. Now, the other things I do want to note when I did the paint over on the hair here is I did pull the turtleneck part on her neck out a bit, and that was to break up that shape just a little bit. But I do like the very triangular shape that you have going on. I think a lot of the shapes do work, especially with the sun and then these waves, or like this almost looks like hair, like stringing hair to me. But having these very direct shapes placed on top of each other, I think does work. The only thing I would say, and this is maybe more of a personal preference, is I would have moved this paper bird, I would have moved it to like right here to kind of fill in that space a bit more, and then it would almost look as if it's creating a, whoop, looks like my email, looks like my Spectrum submission went through. But the actual flow of the paper birds would give kind of this cool rotating spiral effect around her. And I think that would just add to it. I mean, it kind of has it right now, But I think to really pull it forward, I would have done even more so. I would have done more with it. But I like what you have going on here. And I would say, let's see if there's any other big things. Oh, and then looking back at the older one, we also have a tendency to add light above and below the eyebrow, when in reality there really isn't that much of a defining light right there. It's usually more toward the center, and it's usually more minor. But if you are going to have one, like if there really is like a direct light source like pointing right there, and if our skin is sweaty enough that it will reflect it, or if you have makeup or gloss, whatever. But having it on the top and bottom kind of creates this very strange outline effect, and it almost looks like there is a like light pink penciling around the eyebrow. So I literally just painted over it, and it creates more of that matte look and more natural. But since I can tell this might be going toward a little more of a stylization, I didn't want to push it too much in realism, so I stopped there. So those would be my big pieces of critique with yours. And I think if you keep doing things and shots and compositions like this, you're going to have a great portfolio, because I think there's a lot of interpretation that can be had. I think there's a lot of thought going into it, and I feel that if you just keep focusing on proportions and anatomy, especially with the human characters, I think you're going to have some great pieces in the future. But I will say, just do some practicing on proportions, especially with heads, and try to be a little more aware of how the facial features are interacting and the distance between them. Okay, so that is the first one. We're going to jump right back into the next one, and then we'll go ahead and look at the comments here. So this one was by OEK. And the first thing that I noticed, and I made the mistake of not asking in the Discord submissions on what you would like, what you thought you did well, what you thought you could do better, and have more like insight into the piece and where you stand with the drawing. So by having just a blank submission, I'm going to be giving my insight based on my personal preference a little bit. So I think the next time we do a critique stream, I'll ask for more information. That way it can help me give a better critique that's more catered to you in the direction you want to go in. So when I first look at this, there's definitely a lot of like iconography, symbology going on. And obviously I'm a big fan of that kind of stuff. And even with like the star halo behind him. But then there's a lot of things that I think are confusing me. And I think the big one are the light and the shadows, where it almost feels like the hair being blank is definitely a style choice, or this could be a work in progress. But I almost like the idea of it being a matte color with like no rendering or shading at all. Like that's an interesting choice, but then we'll work with it, especially when the rest of the body and then the bird and the snake are kind of rendered out. But I'm going to do a critique based on having more of a, not fully realism, but having just a little bit more to push in the direction of better lighting and better shading for a character that feels more human. Because this feels very plasticky, almost like a doll, the way that it's shaded. And let's see what I did with my paint overs. Oh yeah, so the first thing I did is I did a multiply layer. And just to kind of show the colors that are going underneath, and I could kind of see it with the lighter version, but when I multiplied it, I could really see there's like this very intense orange on one of the shoulders and then this blue on just one of the pecs. And it just feels like the color variation, it feels experimental, which is good, but it doesn't feel very purposeful or with intent. So the thing that I did, I started first painting the bird, but actually I'm going to do that after the next thing that I want to talk about. So the thing I did first was I made the skin very matte. I made it more clean without all the rendering and all the high contrast of light and darks. And you can see how it already feels more like skin. And all it takes for the most part was, I think I just chose, let me see here. I just chose one of the skin colors that I thought fit more of the tone that was implied here. And then I did just a light painting everywhere. And then I gave just some cast shadows from the arm and the bird and the snake on the actual body to give more of a shape, more of a light direction to it. And I think this creates more of it does push it more in the realism realm, but I want you to use this as a base for your work, because I like when people add different colors and have things that don't necessarily fit the realism mold. But I think that this feels a little too little choppy in terms of the color placement, and especially with the scapula or the collarbones here. I think they feel so intense and pushed out that it really makes it feel strange when the rest of the body doesn't feel as thin or as what's that word? When you're like overly thin. But that's the kind of look that neck gives me, but then the rest of the body feels very filled in. So by just giving kind of a matte over, it almost implies the underlying anatomy without it being like superly obvious. And I think when an artist learns anatomy and proportions, they really make it like the forefront of every drawing. So when they draw a character, it's like they make sure that the muscles are seen, and they like overemphasize the shading and the shadows that are because of the muscles. But then it just looks either like a comic book, and if you're doing like superheroes, then it kind of works because they make it look like their characters have 0% body fat. But most people, I would say like 98% of people in the world, don't have bodies that have these very overly musculature, low percentage body fat creations or proportions and anatomy. So instead, I like to imply the underlying anatomy and the muscle structure by just giving like a gentle hint at like the collarbone or the bicep or tricep. I feel that it creates more of not only a realism vibe, but then it gives more to work with, because then you're not pushing in this very unrelatable, almost unrealistic version of a human being. And especially if you look at your own body, unless if you are one of those people that have like 1% body fat, or I think that's impossible. I think like 6% is the lowest it can go. I don't know. I watched a documentary on this long ago. But I think you'll see how subtlety can be your best friend when it comes to anatomy. So that was the first thing I did. The next thing is, if you ever create anything that is white in color, gray is going to be your best friend for this, because when you have something that's pure white, let me see so back to the original, see how the bird and the snake, mainly the bird, it feels so matte, it almost feels like a flat graphic image. And I don't think that was your intent, because I see some shading of shadow. So instead, I would try working with more grays and then let whites be more your highlights. And something that I was taught in college that seemed to really help me was to never use pure black or pure white. And even for highlights, try not even go for your pure white, but like a close to pure white. And that way you can avoid the traps of having your images look very kind of unrealistic. And unfortunately, it's kind of become a negative trope in our art industry that digital images, or artists that are digital artists, tend to use white for lighting and black for shadows. So I'm going to try to push you in a different direction to use color more for your light and shadows. And you'll see how that'll just give a more fleshed out, realized version of what you're trying to create, especially with things that are organic. And with a bird and the snake, I mean, the snake definitely has more shading to it, but the bird felt very flat. And I think with the color white, it's a very tricky color to work with. So when you're working with white, you should really think that you're working with like a light gray, and really push your shadows on it. Even though it's white, it'll still cast shadows. And you really want to emphasize that, and it'll really make the viewer believe that the true color of that subject matter is white, even though it's probably mostly gray. What was the last thing I did on here? Oh yeah, so then from here, I really wanted to push the shadows. And you can see here how I almost like pushed it a bit further than maybe I would even suggest. Let me turn down the opacity. And all I did was I turned on a multiply layer, and I grabbed one of the skin colors with my eyedropper, and I pushed it underneath some of the areas based on the light source that was kind of implied in the painting to begin with. And I just pushed it even further. So when you look at it from here to the first render, Actually, let me put this in a folder so it's easier. You can see how I'm really pushing the skin to be a bit darker, and then the lighter colors of the bird and the snake to be, actually, I'm even making them darker, but because it's pushed against this kind of darker value skin, they really stand out more, and there's more indication and clarity of where the bird and snake end and where the person begins. So I would be very just aware when working with white, especially on a pale subject or pale skin. Just be very careful with how you render it. And then from there, I think it would just be continuing to push it. Well, I thank you, Kezin, for following. I think just keep going in the direction you're going. I like that you're throwing down colors. I went through a phase in college where when I learned about like blue and purple being for shadows and then orange and yellow for lights, all my art all of a sudden became very heavily influenced by that. So I don't want to stop you experimenting with color on your characters, but you can see how when it's more subtle, it can create a cool effect. And then once you start to really understand value more, instead of having like a darker color in the shadows, you can push color like a purple, or even if you want to be more crazy colorful, like my roommate Gawky, she'll push colors that don't fit in realism, but they fit in with the composition better, and they help add contrast, whether it not even just value contrast, but oftentimes hue and saturation, which in my opinion can actually lead to a better contrast when working with color. So that would be my advice moving forward. And I think with the face, it looks pretty good, but my other thing that I noticed is if you're going to have someone looking down at, if he has like the snake and the bird in his hands, do the pose yourself and take a photo reference of you. It kind of looks like you may have done a photo study, but I would have even emphasized it more and like maybe tilted the head and really made it look like he is looking at the heads of it. Because right now it feels like he's pulling his shoulders back and he's trying to like look down from there, which would create a very stiff angle. But if you had it more relaxed and even like moved his head to the side, I think you could create a more fluid pose that would help the flow of the composition a bit more too. So yeah, that would be in my advice with this one. Okay, let me go ahead and look at the comments for just a little bit, and then we'll go and move on to the next two. Mighton says, bodybuilders will get down as low as 3 to 4% for a composition, but they don't stay there, and it's super dangerous for your health, obviously. Okay, that's what I thought. Because I remember watching a bodybuilder, I believe it was, I've seen so many documentaries on bodybuilding, and I watched that one of the World's Strongest Man every year. Or no, World's Strongest Person, because there's a male and female division. And I always find it fascinating. Just like the art world, I get very inspired and motivated by people that are clearly passionate about what they do, even if it's not related to art. So if you're someone like me, I would definitely check out those type of documentaries, whether it's on that or even like fashion with Project Runway or modeling with America's Next Top Model, or even ones that are a little more closely related, like Face Off with sculpting and face prosthetics, or even, what was the other one? Oh, the Skin Wars with body painting. I mean, those are all very competition-based shows, but I think they can help inspire you quite a bit. Or if you're looking for another documentary, watch Jiro Dreams of Sushi. It's just this really old guy that has been making sushi his whole life and is very adamant about getting these necessary ingredients, the way that's prepared, the way it's cut, and he doesn't skimp, and he's very passionate about creating the best sushi in the world. And I remember watching that for the first time and being incredibly inspired. So I would definitely check these type of films and these type of TV shows out where people are battling because they're so passionate to be the best. And the point of it for me isn't to actually win, because the winner gets money, whatever, but the whole thing is the journey. You're watching other people be inspired and passionate to do what they want to do, and I just find it so incredibly motivating. Okay. Let's see, Eric says, would that be shipping to Europe as well? Oh, for the money, or for the book. Or is that extra money? Because that would be understandable. Yeah, it ships international. It is a little extra for shipping just because it costs me more to ship out of the United States. Hello, everyone. Oh, good, Maria. We'll see you at Anime Milwaukee then. Oh, you can call me Elena. Okay, I'm going to add you to the list. And then we will go ahead and get started. I need to remember to drink water for these type of critiques because, I mean, I'm pretty wordy with these streams anyways, but for these type of streams, I'm just nonstop talking pretty fast. Okay. We're going to go ahead and keep moving here. So the next one we have was one of the Patreon backers. This is Honey. And clearly this is something that is down my alley. I love a good graphite drawing, obviously. And I can see that we have very similar elements that we like to include. So when I first look at this reminded me of a drawing that I would do back in the day. And my high school teacher always got so frustrated with me because I would do what she would call chicken scratching. And chicken scratching essentially is when you're doing lines and you like double down on them to create form and shape. Now, I still tend to do a little bit of that, but if you go a little slower, and things that I've learned over the years, if you go a little slower and be a little more confident with the precision, the line becomes a lot cleaner and it will just read as better and more confident. Because right now I see a lot of shakiness to the lines, and I think that's just because you're trying to find the form and the shape of the character, and to do that, these foundation lines are a bit more chicken scratchy. So the thing that I did first was I turned the opacity of your drawing very, very low, and then I did a really quick line paint over, essentially, just to kind of show you the difference between something that looks a little more scratchy and then something that's a little more smooth. Now, that's not to say what you're doing is wrong, because there's a lot of artists that have scratchy lines, and it's textural, and it can add a cool flair to it. Well, I thank you, GingerCake358, for following. But with yours, I want you to focus more on pushing cleaner lines, just because I think that will help in the long run with creating your characters. Because if I was honest, when I was doing my chicken scratching in high school, it's because I wasn't very confident with my line weighting, my line positioning, my composition skills. And my way of compensating for that was just to do as many as I could, and one of those lines would work. And I think now that I'm older, I'm very confident in just like going in with a smooth line. But it took a painting class actually to show me that I was kind of insecure about my lines. And the painter that I worked with, it would take him forever to do one stroke, but when he did it, he'd be very confident, and it was very intentional. So he would like look at his painting and then look at his paintbrush. He would take some of his paint and he would look at it a bit more. And this is life drawing, mind you. So we were looking at a subject. And mind you, I'm there like trying to capture it really quickly. But he's taking his time, and then he would do like one stroke. Grab another thing of paint, look at the model for a bit, look at his painting, look at the model, and then do another one. And he kept going this way. And in the end, he actually turned out to be faster than I was, even though I was chicken scratching the whole thing. But because he was more confident with the intent of the stroke that he was laying down, he was able to finish it quicker than me just trying to like capture it to the best of my ability as quickly as I can without really thinking. And he stopped me, and he, at the end, no, he didn't stop me. He waited till I was done. And at the end, he was like, you know, if you plan more, the execution becomes a lot easier, which has been something that really stuck with me, because I often get ahead of myself where I'm just go, 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 go. But sometimes I need to take a breather, look at it, and then go at it. And now that I've been doing that more frequently, I can just see the quality of my pieces improving, because the confidence is improving as well. So with yours, I think you should try some smoother lines, but then also when you want to have some of that rough edge, you can add it. But at least for your foundation lines, and mind you, this isn't supposed to be like the final line, that's supposed to be like the foundation line. But this is a lot easier to draw on top of than this, just because it's so messy, it can be hard to find a line. So I think my best advice for you would be, when you're doing the chicken scratching, after you do it, take your eraser, like let's say for the ring behind here. I would then erase any of the lines that you didn't really like, or that didn't add to the composition at all. And I would just be creating a very confident, bold line. Because that already, you can see the difference between just A and B. How much more bold it can look too. And especially with the circle, I would use something to draw a circle because I can see a little wobbliness in the circle. And obviously with digital, it's a little easier. All right, right there. And thank you for whoever just followed. Sorry, I missed it. And you can see how, actually, your circle wasn't too off, but there were a little bit that was a bit off. And actually, it may have looked like you used a circle reference beforehand, but because of the lines being so choppy, it almost makes the circle look less like a circle at that point. Oh, okay. Let me, actually, since you are here, let me see what you wrote here. I do struggle a bit with scratchy lines. I'm trying my best to push cleaner lines. I'm definitely not confident in my art, but I'm getting better. Thank you so much for the advice. I'm glad you like my composition. The circle was 1,000% freehanded. That's great. I mean, if you can do a circle that precise without having something to draw on, that's pretty great. So kudos on drawing a pretty good circle. That's difficult to do. And then I guess from here, my next piece of advice would be to bring in more contrast, whether that is having like this, oops, let me bring back my brush. Whether that's pushing more of the darkness you have behind him. Because I do like, and actually I do like the directional scratch that you have going on, the squiggle, because it almost creates like a pattern, like a textile, which I do like. So I'm just bolding this to show the contrast, but I do like the way that you shaded that. And it doesn't have to be the whole paper, because I know how it is working with traditional medium, how that can be very time consuming, especially if it's not a drawing that you want to be focusing on filling in the background. And then even with like the face, let me go ahead and do a quick proportion adjust. I think it just needs to be a little bit adjusted. Not a lot of it, so. Kind of like with the stream last week, try to have the eye in the center of the head. So if you cut the head in half, the eye should land somewhere on that line. Where I feel like on yours, the eye was a bit high. So by pushing in the chin a bit up and pushing the eye down just a touch, it can help with that. Oops, make that. So you can see before and after. And then from here, I actually do like, I mean, this is a good pose for me to draw over. But I will say the one thing is I think you would see more of the other side of the head. It's like here. And you can push that eyelash a bit more out. But I would take out this hair squiggle and push it down a bit more too, just to avoid a tangent. Because something that I've been hyper aware of in my own drawings is to avoid tangents at all costs. And sometimes it can be tricky, but when you start doing it and you're really aware of where your tangents are, it becomes very easy to avoid them. And even for the area under the nose, Why, thank you, Chelly Unicorns, for following. Definitely with the Cupid's bow here, the Cupid's touch, whatever you want to call it, under the nose. I would have it be a little less defined. Let me see it if I like that. And even for the eye here, I think this is a good example where this line here, rather than it being more scratchy, by just really pushing in a more bold line. So yeah, I think you have a great start here. I'm really excited to see where your art goes. And I think the more that you draw, the more that these advice, or the advice that I'm giving, will not only become more prevalent, but I think you'll be able to then be very comfortable with drawing this kind of stuff. And then even here, I would start working on giving just some shading to the face. It doesn't have to be a lot. I mean, I'm definitely someone who likes subtlety with shading as well with my characters. But even having just a little bit can make a big difference. And same with the hair. I think especially wavy hair is so fun to draw. Try to add a little bit more to the hair in terms of actually styling it and give it some more fluff and movement. And I think you'll see how much fun curly and wavy hair can be. Because I was definitely not wanting to draw curly hair when I was in high school and even in college. It wasn't until after I graduated a few years even, that when I started drawing people with curly hair and wavy hair, yeah, it was a little bit more laborious, but the payoff was so worth it. Because in the end, you're like, wow, that's a really cool. It almost looks like a design or like a pattern because of the swirl effect. Okay, and definitely keep working on proportions as well. Because if you want to keep drawing characters, I think having the best sense of anatomy and proportion can really help out. So even here, like the neck feels really big. Let me pull that in. Oops. Pull that in a little bit more. Actually, I might even pull. I think I might pull that shoulder back down. Something like that. Let me see what it looks like. Yeah. So keep going. I think you're on the right path, and practice is definitely the best helper in terms of anatomy and proportion. So good job. Good. I'm glad you like drawing curly hair. Okay, the next one is Zad. So the information that you gave me on this one was that it was a self-portrait, and right off the bat, something like this is definitely not 100% in my wheelhouse because it feels very much more like graphic design or more fine art, but I will give my best to critique it in a way that I find prevalent and hopefully helpful in some way. But like I said, when it comes to this kind of art, it's so... It almost has a intentional graphic nature to it. So sometimes things like this can be a little harder for me to critique, but I'm coming from more of a, obviously, realism background and a composition background, which I know a lot of people are like, what? How are you from a composition background considering all your stuff center frame? But I do have the knowledge of it and like the golden spiral and all the ratio stuff. I just tend to ignore it. So the first thing that I did when I'm looking at this is clearly there's these 4 circles, each receding in size as it goes down. But I feel like there's a lot that gets lost in the actual circles, and I feel like the circles actually hold it back a little bit. Now, I'm not trying to say that I don't think it's ever good to include graphic design elements such as these circles, but the first thing I did notice is the skin feels overly contrasted and vignetted, but I know that's probably part of the design, but for me personally, I feel like it's getting lost and it becomes more like these little bubbles, these light bubbles that pop out. So instead, I tried to uniform the body and I made the whole skin more matte. And I also did push the head up just a bit. It felt very long. So you can see here how, if especially when looking at something that's graphic designy, I try to look at it from far away and how well it reads to the viewer from far away. So from here, you can't fully tell what's going on, but with the skin being more matte, you can tell it's a person and they're being tied up. So going even further into a graphic design element, the next thing I noticed was there is an anchor down below. Now for me, I actually do like finding hidden surprises and Easter eggs in drawings, but I feel like the anchor is so lost in that black circle that it actually takes away from what in my mind reads as someone feeling held down by this weighted anchor. And it almost feels like you're weighted down by sadness, and that's implied by the anchor and the eye that's crying at the bottom. Well, I thank you, XNarfixX, for following. So instead, I took out the circle, and all of a sudden, you can really read that as being an anchor. And you can just almost feel the tugging of the body from the anchor down below. And even from farther away, you can tell now it's a person, most likely an angel, that's being held down by an anchor. So you can see the difference again here. And I don't want it to seem like I'm just someone who's not a fan of graphic design. I think graphic design can work super well when it adds to the overall feeling, where here I feel like the circles are actually distracting from the meaning of the piece, personally. And then I went again and took out the circle behind the body just to really kind of drive it home. And you can see how now it feels like this circle that's being weighted down by a person, which is being weighted down by an anchor. And before, I feel like these dots were actually more of a distraction. Now, I like the contrast going on between a lot of the elements, especially like the wings. I feel like you have a very good sense of where to add darks and lights to create a very heavy contrast, which is great because I love heavy contrast, especially the way you did the halo and the top of the wings being completely white. It creates like a negative space. But I think with the graphic elements, like the circles, I think placing them in different areas might help a bit and being more intentional with them. Because right now it feels like they were an afterthought that were put behind the three circles. And even like when I think of people that use graphic design very heavily, like Muka, or the ones that I'm being more inspired by now, it almost felt like the graphic design elements were a framing element to some degree. And then when it was included with the character, it felt like it was enhancing the image, where I don't know necessarily if I feel like these circles add to it as much. But like I said, I'm not entirely taught in a graphic design background, so maybe there is more to it than even I'm aware, but that was just my opinion looking at it. And then the other thing I noticed was the earring, having it being completely face forward to the audience, when if this is a front shot, more likely the earring would be more on the side. And if you want to show it still, you can see how I turned it just to create more of a illusion that it is being pierced in the ear. And I believe you're in the stream here too. Let me see here. You're welcome, Shelly Unicorns. So that says, I'm inspired by Baroque. That's why I use so extreme contrast between black and white. But you are right. Those two circles make a big difference. Which, I mean, like I said, I like what you're doing here. I love heavy contrast, and I like the direction you're going in. It feels very symbolic. And especially now that I feel like my own art's being pushed more into like iconography. I know what I think you're going for, but I think placing them with more intent would be my biggest critique, because I like what else you have going on here. So yeah, that would be my critique of Zad's image, and I'm curious to see more from you. So keep doing it. And I like the storytelling nature too. I guess I really should mention that too. I was able to kind of form and create my own story based on looking at this image and the idea that to me this feels like someone, especially, okay, something else that people need to understand about like iconography images is when someone places a hand, especially in this one, like over an eye, that isn't just by accident. Like it didn't just so happen that someone's like, oh, where should I put this hand? They're like, oh, I'll put it right over the eye. To me, that feels very intentional and there is a story behind it. And I feel like there's just as much of a story with the clenched fist and the hand covering the eye as there is the ropes being tied around the body with the anchor pulling it down. So when anyone is posing their character, be very aware of where your hand positions are, where your body language is being, or how your body language is being perceived, and what that says to the image overall, because then that can add a huge effect rather than just having a character that is, you know, standing stiff with hands in pockets or whatever. So just my advice with people who are struggling with posing their characters. So my biggest advice is be intentional. And even with my own drawings now, I'm finding hands to be such an expressive outlet of energy that when I'm posing my characters, I'm almost being I'm over exaggerating the pose even a little bit, and I'm making the fingers super delicate and pointy and witchy, because I feel like that adds so much more to it. Even with like, I'm working on this mermaid here, and you can see how the hand positions are very specific. And looking at the masters of yesteryear, when they drew their characters, they were very specific with their hand positioning and made sure that it added to the story that was being told. Because as storytellers with a medium like art instead of film, you have one image to kind of portray a story. And you want every element that you can to be adding to it, rather than being used as like an afterthought. Okay, NZ says, I have tunnels in my ear, so it's not an earring. Oh, it already looks like it, but yes, you're right, it looks wrong. Thank you very much for the critique. You're welcome. Okay. Ooh, let me drink my water really quick. All right, we're halfway through here. We're moving on to Wix D. So this is someone where when I initially open it up, I'm like, wow, this is some great work. And I think for me critiquing, it would just be adding to what you already have going on here. And I'm going to critique it more on a lighting standpoint, because that was the one thing that felt, it was very intentional, but I feel like it kind of missed the mark, for me at least. So with this character, the first thing I noticed was the backpack behind the head kind of makes the whole character look like a lump. And I had a really bad problem doing this in college, where whenever I added accessories to my characters, it kind of just like flowed with the body rather than creating a more interesting silhouette by being like more what would that be called? Basically more off the body and having more angles. And if you blacked out the silhouette, it'd be a more interesting character. Where if you blacked out a lot of my characters in college, they'd be very similar, and it'd be hard to discern one from another. So the first thing that I did, well, actually, there's two things I did in this one paint over. So I'll talk about them first. The first one was the backpack behind the head. I lightened, because you do have this very distinct color palette, and as you get further back in the scene, it becomes this more light brown. So I took that and I added it to this, I guess I should be calling it more like a sleeping bag, and I added it to create that silhouette, especially on the back of the head and in the front, and it separated the head from that element a bit more, where before you can see how it all kind of blends together. And then the next thing I did is I really pulled the light source behind the head, because with the rim lighting that you have going on with the character, it implies that the lighting is behind the character, and it's such an intense light that it creates this thin line around the whole body, which is called rim lighting. And I like that you have that going on there, but you also in the original had such an intense light on the shoulder guard that it almost implies that there is a heavy light behind the character and then there's a really intense light in front of the character. But what was weird is it felt like only the shoulder pad was receiving the light and then nothing else on the character except for maybe a little bit of the face. And you could say that because if there's a crowd of people that it is blocking the light from being passed on to the character. But the way that I read it, I think I would keep more of the rim light and him being more in shadows, especially since he has this bag of gold. But the other thing I noticed as I look down is there's this bag of gold and there's a dragon or some type of creature, reptilian creature by his feet. And it's almost like he's sniffing the gold. But it's almost hard to see, but the bag's actually torn open and there's a pile of gold next to it. So when I did my paint over, a really easy storytelling trick is to capture a moment while it's happening. So literally having just a couple gold pieces fall out, it implies the whole thing. Either the dragon ripped the bag open or the bag just got ripped and there's gold falling out. Where now there's a story right here by just adding, literally I just did 2 strokes of that gold color. And the other thing with this image is everything feels very pillow shaded, which basically means when something is heavily lit in the center and then it fades out to the edges. But when you're including a realism lighting setup, pillow shading really doesn't work anymore. And that's where the big thing with pillow shading is there usually isn't any hard shadows from cast shadows. So like on the bag here, you can see how before there's like a soft gradient shadow all around. But if the light source is coming from behind and overhead, I want to see more of a shadow line casted from the arm here. And then the light source would start because that's where it would be hitting the strongest. And then it would go down. And then even with some bounce light, gold usually has a reflective quality to it depending on how rustic the gold is. So I painted some of that gold color back on the bag underneath here. You can see the difference before and after. So that was, I guess, this was like my example that I want to be seen implemented everywhere. And I tried to do a little bit more up here, but I would have to really repaint a bunch more if I wanted to recapture that same scenario down here everywhere. But I did take the time to focus on the top of the arm guard, the rest of the body. I put it more matte. And even with the belt buckles, from far away, I feel like they're very thin and it doesn't really add much of a bulkiness to his waist area. So I made the buckles a bit bigger to help pull some of that strength in the buckles down. Because when they're so thin, it almost creates more of this delicate, like a princess would be wearing this type of a belt. But if you make the buckle a bit bigger, it almost feels like it's adding to the character. It's like this character seems to be strong and small, but the buckles are also small, but they're also strong, you know? Just reinforcing and reincorporating who that character is with what they're wearing. The next thing I did is I noticed it was pretty dark, so I lightened it up quite a bit, in the back at least. And this also lets you see what he's wearing more while still being in shadow. And then the third thing was I gave it more of a warm hue. I do like fantasy art in the storytelling nature that it creates. And oftentimes when I think of fantasy, especially with like high fantasy, I think warm colors and a warm palette. So you can see before and after how it's definitely a lot more contrasted. So the character pops out a bit more against that background. And also it has more of a warm feeling where before the colors just feel very much as is. Like the leather is brown, the metal is gray, the dragon is green, the gold is the gold color, the ground is gray. Or if you add this tonal shift, and it's really easy to add one, all of a sudden the colors become mixed with this warm color and the whole scene becomes a bit more lively. And that would be my biggest advice with this one. I think you already have a great painting skill, and you can see it in the way that you're placing down the brushstrokes. And even in the character itself, I feel like he has personality, and I just want to see where it goes from here. Okay. I'm going to keep moving on here. I know we're moving kind of fast, but I want to keep up the schedule here so we can have a Q&A at the end. The next one is Matt's. And Matt is someone I actually know, and he also lives in Wisconsin and is also primarily a traditional artist. So it's been funny that you submitted because uh, also being a pencil artist, I feel like there's a lot of advice I can share and blah, blah, blah. But I like seeing the path that you're going down without any of critique from me. So when you submitted, I was like, okay, I think now's my chance to say some things, but I still want to push you on this exploration path because when I look at your art, it is so wild and bizarre and textural, and it really just seems like you don't care about traditional standards of what art is meant to look like and how everything is meant to look so pretty. And I like that you're going against the grain. It's actually something that with my really large piece, I want to capture that same feeling of there's a lot of detail and noise everywhere, that it takes a little bit for your eyes to kind of adjust and look at it to really decipher what is exactly going on. But since I'm going to critique this more from the stance of how I normally critique things, I'm going to push some advice your way, and you can either take it or leave it. I will not get offended if you're like, I don't like any of what you're saying. I totally get it. And I almost want to continue encouraging you to go down this weird path and have art that is very unique. So I have a lot of, I think, edits just on my first layer. So the first thing I will say, when I look at this drawing specifically, there's a lot happening. There's a lot of textures, and the contrast is kind of scattered. When I look at this, there might be some implications of contrast up here. Oops. Up here with like the gradient going outward from these white spinal looking areas here. And even with this very like heavy dark body against a white background, like I can see different areas, or even like the back of the hair here with the feather being dark and then the bottom spikes from the head being darker. So I can see the contrast, but there's so much different elements of contrast going on that it actually becomes more of like noise, and it really doesn't add that contrast impact that it can add. So let me see what the first layer I did. Oh yeah, okay, so the first thing I did is when I'm looking at this actual pose, it definitely feels, I mean, obviously it's this very mutated creature, but I think just to add a little more element of like posiness, I pushed the back even further to create more distance between him and the scroll that he's holding. And that was just to give more of a composition. And I straightened out some of the back and like the horns and even this area, because now we have this movement going on, where I think before it's a little bit more wobbly, which mind you, I don't hate either. But I think if I'm going for more of like a traditional composition, this has more of a cleaner flow to it. But the thing, I mean, that's give or take. But the thing that I really wanted to touch on with your work, or with this piece specifically, is adding contrast that really pushes the viewer's eye in different areas of the drawing. So here is my quick paint over. Now, mind you, it doesn't have to be this dark, but you can see how before and after, there's definitely a clear division of where the eye is going, and I'm like sectioning off more of the drawing in different pieces. So I love a dark hand that fades into a lighter area, where before you can see how the hand, the feather, and the scroll kind of have the same level of contrast, so it's hard to define one from the next. But having the hand be darker and the scroll behind it be a bit lighter, all of a sudden there's a very clear indication of where one ends and one begins. And then same with the arms here. The arm, the hair, the head, this arm piece, and then the body all kind of have, actually, why don't we do this? So if we just section out this area here, you can see how similarly they are all shaded, and it's hard to discern one section from the next. So when I do this, let me put the green thing over it. You can see the shapes are clearly defined. Now, mind you, like I said, I like texture, I like what you have going on, but I think having the readability be a bit stronger by having contrast that feels more intended to different areas, I think could help redirect the viewer's eye around the piece rather than it being like a searching puzzle within. So my biggest advice is let parts of your drawing breathe. Not everything has to be overly textured. And I know you're like me in the sense where I like texturing everywhere. I like there being a sense of every part of the drawing was touched by me. It has a purpose and there's detail in every corner. But when you do that, it can actually lose some of the strength of the area where you want the drawing to have its strength, because then it's like sapping it all around. Even with like my drawing with all the hands, I have a very clear, like it's very noisy, but I have a very clear sense of where I want the viewer to look. And that's not, I mean, who's to say that that's a good thing? But I think in terms of like traditional art and composition, having there be a very intentional direction and language with the way that the viewer reads the piece can be important. So when I look at your art, I love how abstract and weird it is, and I would just like to see more areas of your drawing breathe, and then it'll allow the areas that are strong to be even stronger than they already are. And it doesn't even have to be this contrasted. I mean, I went very bold. I mean, you could even be a little more subtle with it, and you can see the difference before and after, how there definitely is a little more of sectioning that goes off with looking at it. You can kind of tell a little bit more clearly what's going on. So yeah, that would be my critique for you, Matt. And obviously, I love the direction you're going in. I love that you don't care what's conventional art, and I want to just encourage you to keep going in your direction. Okay, so next we have cactus. And this one, immediately, it makes me smile. I love children's books. If I wasn't a illustrator doing what I'm doing now, in college, I really wanted to be a children's book illustrator. And I think that's because there's a lot of magic in the work, and it's not really focused on realism, and it's not focused on I should say it's more focused on the artist's style, and the style really shines in children's books because I think there's a level of, one, I don't care, and two, it's meant to be read by a kid, so a child should be able to look at this and pick up what's going on right away. And to me, I think that's art that works really well in terms of telling a story, because when I look at an image, if I'm like struggling to figure out what's going on or what it is, more often than not, I don't want to be looking at it for too long. That doesn't mean I don't like complex imagery. I love pieces that have a lot of detail and a lot going on. But I think with children's books, it's very clear, it's intentional, and it's strong. And I feel that a little bit with this drawing here. But my biggest critique with you, especially when I looked at this the first time, is there is a lot that gets lost. And I think it's because of similar colors and tangents. So the best example for me with editing yours, I don't want to turn on all these layers. Oh, surprise spoiler. But I guess I'll point them out first, and then I'll show the layers that I drew on here. So it looks like the arm is actually the edge of the frog's throat here. So it almost implies that the edge of the frog is here and it goes down. And it's similar to the shape over here, so it would look like that would be correct. But by having the arm there, it's actually misleading, and it creates this very uncomfortable tangent, because then... And if you don't know what a tangent is, it's basically, for those of you watching, it's basically when two things line up like really close, or like they're just touching, and it creates this uncomfortableness. Sometimes it's intentional. You'll see artists that intentionally put tangents in their work. But I think with this, it's very unintentional, and I think you should practice more with creating compositions that don't include tangents, so that you can understand when to use them if you want to, but avoiding them is usually the best advice I can give. And then the other thing is her cape is such a similar color as the frog's belly that the cape definitely gets lost. And then the frog's back leg here almost looks like the back of her cape. And it almost like you have to double take just to make sure what you're looking at is actually what you're looking at. And if that ever happens with the viewer, more often than not, they'll feel like the artist didn't know how to handle the composition that they were trying to create. So I would just implore you to be more aware of where your things are lining up against one another. So I'm pretty sure I'm going to turn all these off really quick. So the number one thing is I grabbed your character and I moved her over. And I think it would still give the same effect with her being right by the frog casting the spell. But by moving her over, you can see all of a sudden we break the tangent from the side of the head. We break the tangent from the back of, or the cape and the belly. But I'm really starting to push it when I add a darker shade to the frog, because then the frog's limbs, which felt very much like they were melting into the floor under him, all of a sudden becomes very clear and separated between the subject matter and the ground that the frog's sitting on. And then from there, I push the values on her to really bring her forward more against the back of the frog. And then you know what? I would even make, now that I'm looking at this paint over more, I would push lighter tones behind the frog, or on the frog, so it brings the girl out a bit more. So I would have the girl be a bit darker. Like that. And you can see how, because of the value contrast alone, the girl really pops out now, and there's a clear division of where the frog ends and the girl begins. And then the last thing I did, which is definitely more optional, is highlights. Now, I am not one to recommend highlights often because I find that they become overused, especially in digital art. And since this is traditional, it's not really that big of a problem. But I added a little bit of highlights to the frog just to show how to add some slipperiness to the frog, make it look a little wet and have more of that skin surface that a frog has. And like I said, this isn't necessarily 100% you have to do it, just a suggestion. And with her glasses, I did tint them a little bit. Actually, that was a lot of it, like there, just to give a depiction of glass on, especially at an angle, they'd probably be reflecting the sky a little bit. And because glasses, while they're not the most reflective in terms of like having direct light, reflect off, usually it's like a little lighter. So I added that there. And then the last thing I did was the whole image. I wanted to make it look a little more warm, push it more in that like storybook category, and I upped the contrast. So here was the final that I pushed, and this is just to showcase more even the ground with the frogs and the grass that he's standing on to be separated more. And I did notice when I did that there's these other frogs that I would then paint in as well to be a bit darker. That way they stand out too. So for yours, let me show before and after. Now mind you, I'm definitely one for more contrast, but if that's not your flavor, let me go ahead. I'm going to do one more thing to yours. And I'm going to show you how it doesn't have to be necessarily more contrasty, but I think having color contrast will be also something to work and play with. So let's find a good... Oh, I kind of like that one. So you can see how this is less contrasted, but it definitely feels like the frog, the girl, and the ground are more separated. And if you look at it before and after one more time, you can see how there's more of that division. So my biggest critique with you, I think if I haven't repeated myself enough times, was to just be aware of tangents and having different subject matters be separated by the placement of each figure. Okay. Now the very last one here is Kianya. And this one was submitted this morning. And since this was a Patreon member, I decided to bring this one on as well. And obviously, this is right down my wheelhouse. Having traditional work that is very focused on contrast, negative space, and gradients. Like, this is definitely everything that I do, and even like the lack of pupil that I always do. So this is something that I think feels very comfortable for me to critique. Well, thank you, Reverberant, for following. And this is definitely not to be... I don't feel like I have a lot of negative to say, because I don't want to push you into doing more of what I would do, because I don't want you to just become a clone of what I do. But instead, I'll try to look at this more objectively and what I would say if I had a completely different style. So the first thing that I notice when I look at this is the arm, or I like the negative space in the arm, and I like the negative space in the body. I love playing with those type of abstract ideas. But the arm and the body melt area looks like they blend right into each other. And that could be intentional, but it feels like it was happening because of the placement of the arm, and it didn't feel as intentional as I think it was meant to be. I feel like it should be a separate entity that happens to also be hollow. So the thing that I did is I moved the background down more, and then I moved the arm hollow down a bit more as well. And I'm trying to create more of a separation between the body contrast and the arm contrast. Not because I think this composition doesn't work, but I do feel like it's a tangent, just kind of like the last one, where it doesn't feel intentional. It feels like by coincidence there's this tangent that wasn't meant to be there. So I lowered the arm, I lowered the back of the body, and by lowering the back of the body, I added more of a contrast between the hair and the back melt as well. But actually, as I'm looking at this, I wouldn't do as many strings as I did here. Kind of going with your theme of more subtlety here. Something like that. And I do feel like there is definitely a very clear style here. I don't think it's like full realism. It almost has a storybook quality to it as well. But the one thing I did notice is the face with the cheek. The lightness right under the cheek felt a bit almost like too unrealistic, where it didn't fit with even the style. So it should feel something more like this if you're going for that lighting scenario. But that's not say what you had was wrong. I guess this is just a suggestion from me of having the cheekbone look a little more prominent and not like this very clear white line separating the cheek and the lower half of the chin. And then the other really big critique I had, I mean, because for the most part, I don't have a lot to say with this one. I feel like this kind of holds it together pretty well. But the hand on this side feels very wobbly. And it feels like this was taken from a reference picture. But for those of you who take reference pictures, sometimes when you draw something, it might look exactly like the reference picture, but the reference picture might look so wrong or look so off that when you draw it, it looks wonky. And I think the thing that looks wonky to me with the hands here are the knuckles are almost non-existent. And that probably was true with the picture. The knuckles probably weren't that prominent. But it's almost like you have to emphasize and like adjust the drawing a little bit, just because this isn't going for realism and the hand just looks misproportioned. So I just did a quick paint over to showcase. Actually, even that's a little dark. It could be lighter, to be honest. Let me turn the opacity down. It could even be like that. But by hinting a little bit more at the knuckle bones, it does break up what looks like this kind of massive chunk of a shape. It doesn't really read like a hand to me, as it feels like a shape. And just by implying those little details like the knuckle bone, I think it just brings out the hand more. Even with like this side here, now that I'm looking at it more, you can see how just by separating it just a little bit, you can see how much of a difference that can make in the final product. So honestly, this is one that I feel like I want to keep pushing you in the direction you're going in. I feel like you do have a confidence in your work. You definitely have patience in the way that you render the hair. Clearly, you care about your craft. And my biggest critique was they were very minimal. And my best advice for you is to keep going. Keep pushing in the direction of what you're doing. I love that you're putting the hands in very specific, intentional positions. And I would even push it further. So right now you have it like this. Next, I would even push it further. You know, like have the hands interacting with the body more, especially when it's pressed against the skin. Really press it. Really press it so that you can see the skin being affected by the push of the hand. And those little grooves and the bumps that you create when the skin is touching or when the hand is pushing on the skin can create more of a sense of drama with the way that they're not only placed, but the way that they're interacting then with the body. So that'd be my biggest advice for you. Okay. Honestly, you know what? I'll end it there. And I like what you're doing with the little swirly pattern. And I just want to keep pushing you in the direction you're going as well. So with all of these, I want everyone to know that these were some really great images. I don't feel like there were ones that I felt were too undeveloped for me to critique. I think sometimes I'll get critiques from artists that are too young and they haven't really developed any flavor or style to their work or any type of composition or anatomy. And it feels harder to critique because you almost need to just tell them, you just need to draw more and you need to do more fundamental work. But with these images, there's definitely a lot of understanding going on already. And I'm hoping that my advice kind of pushed you even further down the path that you're already started for yourself. So yeah, if you have any questions, I guess we have a little bit time left here. I'll do like a 5-minute, maybe, yeah, around 5-minute Q&A, and then we'll cut the stream off. And I just want to thank everyone who submitted to the critique stream. We'll have our next one in March, and I will post another group in the Discord and as to when that will be, and you can submit there. If you watch this and you're like, man, I really want my stuff critiqued, then definitely submit there, and by March, you'll probably see yourself there. And especially if you're a Patreon backer, I'll for sure pick you. Unless if there's more than 8, then I will have to be more random with my selection. Let's see here. ProBMFK says, how do you capture an image like this for prints without getting paper texture? This one's a little more interesting. And thank you. Oh, I missed who that was, but thank you for following. Basically, I'm psycho enough where I will literally take an eraser and everywhere that isn't the drawing, I will literally erase it or I'll paint white on top of. So it actually takes me a lot longer to make prints, and even like the art book that I had and that the new one that I'm about to make, it'll take me a long time to edit them. It takes me a long time because I don't like just upping the contrast in the settings, because I want the drawing to still feel like the original pencil drawing. I just don't want the paper texture around it. But I've heard of people that will do like an adjustment layer, curves, and will try to basically heighten the lights enough where the little wrinkles in the paper texture become non-existent. But oftentimes that'll affect the whole drawing as well. So I would just be more careful with how you're doing it. If you're going to scan it, especially, you'll most likely get paper texture. Like 100% probably will get paper texture. And sometimes it's not bad. I think people actually like seeing the paper texture sometimes when they're buying a print. So don't necessarily think that it's a bad thing. Let's see here. Hanny says, you say my piece was developed, but I feel like my art is all over the place. I know what I like, I know what inspires me, but I don't know how to make it into something cohesive. What can I do about this? I hate to be that person that says just keep practicing, but that's the first thing I'll say. So just to get that one out of the way. Because you are essentially trying to bridge the gap. Let me go ahead. I'm going to find a video really quick. Oh, where did I put that in? Because there is a video that directly talks about this. Oh, I used to have it saved. Where did I put it? Here, you know what? I can find it really quick. Essentially, you have a lot of inspiration, a lot of visual library, a lot of very clear likes and dislikes in creative mediums, and you don't know how to express it yet because you don't have the technical understanding to execute what you're seeing in your head. So let me see if I can find... Oh, shoot. Am I not going to be able to find this? But there's a video that my friend Deandra showed to me, and it's called Bridging... Is it Bridge the Gap or Bridging the Gap? Where essentially you practicing and you working to develop your style and, like, you know, looking at anatomy courses and studying them and practicing on your own, and then looking at value and composition and color and contrast and all this stuff, and you're experimenting with it in your own work. That's you literally building the bridge from where you're at to where you want to be. And more often than not, especially with artists that don't feel as developed as it sounds like you are, you're at this island and you see all these other artists that are creating things that they want to write out their head, and they're able to get it down on paper. But it's because they've had years of experience and years of hours just under their belt of failures and, you know, mistakes, that they're able to now create it. And it's hard sometimes being at this side, being like looking at everyone else, being like, well, why? I want to be there, but I also am embarrassed by where I'm at now. And I definitely felt that before, even in college. So what you have to do is literally build that bridge, and it's going to be a very laborious and taxing time building that bridge, but eventually you'll get there. Now, but here's a little inside secret that I think everyone needs to hear, because even I feel like even though I feel like I did cross that first one where I'm able to create what I want in my head, now there's another island further away that's like creating these bigger, grander pieces, and I'm on this island still. And to get to that island where you're building grander, even cooler pieces than what you are now, I have to bridge that gap. And yeah, it's going to be very taxing, and there's a lot of drawings like this giant one here that when I get going on that one, it will be taxing, and I'll feel it. It'll be time consuming, and it'll be a struggle. There'll be times I'm sure I'm frustrated, but to be a good artist, you have to be okay with getting frustrated and then figuring out a way, so like problem solving a way past it. And the best artists, in my opinion, are the ones that are able to creatively problem solve on the go, and any hurdle that comes their way, they can jump it. And usually that comes with practice of, like, a hurdle could be like anatomy, but after you first hit it, you smack on it and you fall down. But after a while, and the more that you study and practice it, you learn, oh, okay, I have to jump this high, I have to jump this far before the hurdle. You learn the technique on how to get over that hurdle. So now when you see a master work, especially like Kim Jong-gi or something, when they see anatomy as a hurdle, they can hop over it without even looking, because they've done it so many times. They've, taught themselves how to do it. And I don't want you to feel discouraged by where you're at now, because it's a very normal feeling to be feeling at the level that I'm seeing with your work. So even with what you have here, clearly you have interests in things like graphic design or fantasy, and I think just exploring it more. And the way to get better is by doing. So keep pushing yourself and understand that frustration is required. It's almost an element of, what's a good way to say that? It's like to level up in the next level of this art world that we're in, you need to beat the boss of, let's say, anatomy, of composition, of color. And the more that you level up, the better items you get, the more bosses you're able to tackle and the more dungeons you feel more confident entering because you're more equipped with yourself. And usually confidence will carry you quite a ways through that. So if you're a confident artist, even if you're a not technically sound artist, your confidence will carry you through, and eventually the technical ability will follow. But I feel like most artists aren't as confident, and it's more of a struggle for them to catch up to the more confident artist. So my best advice is just to keep doing and to do often. Try to draw literally for at least 6 hours a day. And I know that sounds like a lot, but if you really want to get good, I don't want to sugarcoat it and be like, oh no, just give it like 15 minutes every day, you'll be fine. Like, no, you really got to invest some time, especially if you're a younger artist. And it will pay off. Think of it as you're investing that time in yourself. You are your own business if you want to think of it like financial independence. And the more hours that you spend drawing, the more that you're investing in that business. And the payoff won't be for years, but when it does, usually it's a big payoff. So keep working at it. Okay. Started Draining says, how do you go about publishing art books? I'm actually going to make a tutorial series on that, so stay tuned. Because there's a lot to it. I can't just explain it through a quick Q&A answer. Maria says, just a quick unrelated question. I just bought an iPad Pro for doing art and it arrived today. I'm so excited. You have an iPad, right? Do you use Procreate on yours? I absolutely do. And I love it. Actually, you know what I can show you? I do all my swordplay thumbnails on here before I print them and then make them traditional. Because I like to lay it out knowing where the words are going to go. Because if I start traditional and then the words are actually bigger, I don't want to have to restart the drawing. So I use the iPad to start me off. And then even with like the Imagine FX creation that I'm working on, I'm doing that first on the iPad Pro. I know this will probably be really hard to see with the glares. Yeah. But it's this angel piece that I'm working on. And I wanted to do it first on the iPad to kind of get my composition, know what look I'm going for, and then print it out. So yeah, I love the iPad. I'll do like 2 more questions because my voice is giving out here. Zad says, thank you, Tim. You were so right with erasing these 2 circles. Unfortunately, I can't do it because my drawing is fixed and bordered already, but I realize I must do more thumbnails on my compositions where I start the whole piece. It's still a bit hard to do good Baroque high contrast pieces, but I will try my best to improve myself. Once again, thank you for critique. That is literally you are the prime example of what I wish everyone that got a critique would say, where basically you're acknowledging what was said, and even if you disagree with it, you're still thankful for the critique, for seeing how constructive it may be. And I've critiqued a lot of people in my life, and there were times when especially when I went to college as a teacher's aide, they were just so defensive, and I feel like they weren't really listening because in their head, they wrote me off. Well, at that time I was younger, so they wrote me off, and they wanted to believe that they were holding on to this weird concept that since it was a personal drawing, that it cannot be critiqued, that it is above criticism. And in my mind, I'm like, do you want to get better or not? Because if you want to, you're going to have to hear critique. So I'm glad. Thank you for being such a sport. And I'm glad that it helped. Henny says, I already draw about 10 hours a day because of Art University, but yes, I understand. Thank you. Then just you're already doing it. I'm excited for you because the more that you do it, the more that you'll get comfortable, and eventually you'll start to recognize in yourself that it's become easier. And that's a really cool point when you hit that. Tischel says, how to art. How do you art? Well, you just do. Okay, I think that's it. All right. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for coming. I'm really losing my voice right now. I gotta go. Thank you, everyone, for coming to this live stream. We do these every Wednesday at 2 p.m. Central Time. And next week, what is next week? January. I will probably announce the winners to the emoji contest. So you have like a week, or no, you have till the end of the month. So I guess I'll show what the submissions are so far, and then we'll kind of, I guess, wait the extra 2 days to announce the winners. But next week, I'll probably do something more fun. And until then, I'll be on Discord. So yeah, if you want to join our community, there's a link below. And I'm on there every day. I might not be like 100% active every day, but I'm on it every day and I'm reading what you guys are posting. So I'm like this weird lurker that's also running it. So thank you so much. Okay, take care everyone, and I hope you have a great day. Get some more drawing done, and thanks again to everyone that submitted for critique. That was awesome. Okay, bye. Bye.